dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, you are listening to Dystopian Fiction has been moved to current affairs with your co-hosts Claire and Marcia, and this is our 13th episode on downsizing. Claire, would you want to do a little synopsis of this movie?
Yeah, I could try and do this. So this was Marsha's choice, even though they hadn't actually seen it at the time. But I think it's a good one. It's a 2018 film. It stars Matt Damon and Hong Chow. Probably deserves a mention as a major character or a major actor in this. And just to like weird sort of science fictiony film that tries to do quite a lot but has the basic premise that as an environmental innovation it's been proposed and the science has been created basically to shrink people down to being really tiny, like 10, 12 centimeters tall.
Yeah.
And it follows the story of Paul and his wife, and they're not his wife, and the other people that he meets after he has been shrunk. And it explores it's a comedy. So on the one hand, it's just kind of a bit silly, and on the other hand, it tries to do serious messaging, I think, about social justice issues and environmental issues and people's attitude to those without kind of coming out with any sort of, this is very different from something like Don't Look Up, where there's a kind of like finality to sort of the side you should have been on. This is sort of more nuanced in a way and looking at the way in which different people can react to environmental crisis, and whether actually it's the environment that drives people to make decisions or whether it's actually their own personal circumstances and the economics of it. So yeah, an interesting one, definitely. I was interested to see that it was so mixed in terms of its reviews.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
Hong Chow was nominated for a Golden Globe for this.
Really?
This was her
Wow.
breakthrough film. Yeah, Best
Because I'd
Supporting
never
Actress.
really heard of it
No,
before.
neither had I.
I think I saw it on. I think a lot of people, if you're on TikTok these days, you get these little clips of like sort of these weird niche movies that people
Oh,
watch, and this is where I saw
yeah.
the original clip of them like signing the. Well, we'll get onto the details in a bit, or the sort of ideas and concepts around the downsizing, but the actual sort of signing away their lives and going through
Yeah,
the like procedures, the little
yeah.
clip that I saw, and I was like, this looks really interesting. But no, I literally had no clue. What else has she been in? Do we know?
Since then, The Whale, I think, is the other really big title thing, but quite a lot of like TV stuff that, like The Night Agent, for example, on Netflix last year, that was quite a big thing. And yeah, just quite a lot of different stuff. But I thought it was interesting because not only do I think is that Hong Chow is in many ways the standout kind of actor in the film. I mean, obviously Matt Damon is, the sort of famous one, but she is a was a Vietnamese refugee. So her background kind of mirrors in some respects the character that she plays. Yeah, I was just interested to find out more about her. So
Mm.
she's an American, but say this role I think was quite a breakthrough for her. But we should come back to her because she doesn't actually turn up in the film
Mhm.
for the first half.
Yes,
Um,
literally.
so, I mean, the whole thing kind of opens with something that made me think of you, science and labs and
Yes.
unfortunate rats and things like that.
Yep, indeed.
So what did you think about the sort of the way that the supposed science was put across?
I mean, I was watching it with my course friends at the time, so I think we were all a little bit skeptical. It was interesting for sure. I think the concept there was sort of, they're like giving us these little snippets over like the sort of panning shots of like lab rats and sort of syringes and all these things. Yeah, I think they sort of talk a lot about well, obviously the idea is you're shrinking these people, but they sort of say about like cellular shrinking and
Hmm.
the idea of this, you are exactly the way you are. You've just genuinely the like size of you has reduced, including your like mass and surface area, and that's you sort of start to like run into a couple of problems ultimately, which I think are like plot holes. But I guess that's all part of science fiction. There's
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
there's sort of fiction there.
I mean, I'll put this in the show notes, but there's a good blog that we were talking about on the Warwick University website that basically looks at this kind of interest in science fiction, looking at kind of the idea of miniaturization and the different ways that it could be done, and going back to kind of films from the beginning of talking film. You know, this goes back to stuff in the 30s. And then I think kind of like probably most memorably for certainly my generation, I'm a little bit young for it, was Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, exploring that idea of miniaturizing people using science in some way or other. Do you want to explain to us what the problems with this are?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of number of different sort of things you'd really run into. So obviously, I think we mentioned before, number one, you probably just die instantly. Breathing would not be possible. It's a lot to do with the sort of inflation of the lungs, and especially like the atmospheric pressure, you know, outside of that, and the sort of pressure inside of your lungs and how that operates, the inflating and sort of deflating. So ultimately, they'd probably just collapse, and you wouldn't really make it very long.
I read something about how you'd have to also be able to like miniaturize air molecules, basically, so that like everything was relative to the size of the human for their physiognomy to work. Yeah.
Which at that point is kind of like, oh, now it starts to get physicsy, and I'm not sure how much you can shrink atoms and molecules. I think that'll just be breaking like almost all laws of sort of science there.
Yeah.
But like I think that there'd also be a lot of issues. So I was doing a experiment. These practicals going to have to writing up a little lab report. But even size affects the way that we're looking at how height affects heart rate within sort of this data set of patients that we had, and ultimately we're doing some sort of physiological research on why as like organisms become smaller, their heart rate increases. So for example, the heart rate of a mouse is much
it's like pip,
higher,
isn't it?
than that of like a whale. Part of that is due to everyone learns GCSE biology, the sort of surface area to volume ratio.
That was a very long time ago for me, so you know, you keep going.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be maintaining because you're more likely as a smaller organism, you'll have a higher surface area to volume ratio. You're going to be losing heat a lot quicker than you would as a larger animal, a larger organism. So your heart needs to compensate for that by beating a lot faster and producing a higher cardiac like output. Including that, you'd have to eat a lot more. And I think I was also doing a bit of reading about the fact that we have a very long digestive tract. 3 to 4 times like longer than us, higher than us, right? And that's sort of, you know, the purpose of that is to be able to digest the quite like complex foods that we eat, you know, your sort of steak and chips and, you know, paellas and seafood and all that. Probably, you know, you're not gonna get much nutritional value of that, just because it would be so much smaller. You wouldn't have the ability to absorb all those nutrients. So yeah, even the sort of diet you'd be taking in, etc., etc.
I think that's really interesting insofar as I know that, you know, they mostly sort of everything just seems to be like
just normal,
made smaller, and you know, however, like, you know, how do you, I don't know, manufacture rice so that the grains are smaller, or are they just grinding it up? So, you know, that's not necessarily kind of covered, although all we do hear is that they can't get chervil and he had to use dill in the dinner. So like everything else seems to have been solved. It's just the ability to get certain herbs tiny enough.
The herbs is, why would herbs be the issue? That's my question.
I mean, obviously, like with meat producing animals and things like that, we see that those have been sort of miniaturized just like the humans have. I think we hear at the beginning that the only thing they can't do is like crustaceans, so you're not going to get any shellfish. Or if you do, like the shellfish would be like a massive like centerpiece of your like one prawn for a whole family or something.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of sort of biological interest, because they had to remove all the hair was one of the things,
Yeah.
and the teeth.
Can you tell me why their hair?
So I think they mentioned within the movie. Probably need to do a bit more research on this exactly, but my assumption is that you're shrinking the cells, but since hair is just keratin, it's not actually like a
Yeah.
a living
Okay,
cell. It's
that makes
just a
sense. But wouldn't they have to pull out your fingernails?
Oh God! Even
Sorry
just
about
the
that.
thought. I did sit here. Yeah, they so for the listeners here, if you haven't seen it, they shave everything off. Like when we say everything, like everywhere,
Everything.
everything.
That's right.
They pull out your teeth, which is oh God,
They
it's
pull out your
like
teeth because of the fact that they can't shrink
it's like
things
they
like
can't shrink.
fillings and so on, isn't
Yeah,
it? And
so but yeah, I mean, yeah. So ultimately, I think they said that with the fillings and probably the same sort of story with the hair, since they can't shrink, they're not,
yeah.
technically cells like that. They're gonna stay the same size, and you just explode, like your head explodes or something. That's what they explained it as.
There's the woman who the one who has cancer later on, and we just told, oh, her husband, they forgot to take the gold out of his teeth, and
Oh,
Noglan is just going, his head
oh,
explode.
oh no.
It's like,
Yeah, exactly. It's just, I mean, I think again, there's that sort of like, well, not discriminatory feature, but I guess there are limitations, even in this sort of science fiction world, people who have, like certain like implants and like pacemakers, for example, have
yeah.
these sort of prosthetic limbs. Well, I guess prosthetic limbs are less of an issue, but
Yeah, but we are told that somebody with a hip replacement is ineligible, even though you would have
yeah,
thought that that could basically be removed and then
removed and then
put back in. It's not like a
reimplanted. Yeah.
pacemaker where you might die when you don't have it in or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. It's quite curious, but there's a lot that goes on. But we're also saying you wouldn't really see anything. It'd be freezing. The one that I was very like interested by was you were saying how we could jump a lot higher.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly the stats, but it was something like being able to like jump 20 inches, so that's what, 4 times the
Oh
the
my God.
height, in the same way that like an insect or something can jump. So that, I think, yeah, that was interesting. I was also thinking about the fact that their voices stay at the same resonance. So if you had shorter vocal cords, then that resonates at a different frequency, right? So they'd be like tiny squeaky voices.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was an interesting thing. And the other thing that I was thinking about was just like the ways that when this has been done before, like different like science fiction writers have taken it in different sort of directions. So I think there's a movie called Fantastic Voyage, which I want to say was maybe like the 50s, 60s, I think. And it was, I think subsequently a novel was written on it by Isaac Asimov, so one of the kind of great science fiction writers of the 20th century. And I think he put at the beginning like, physics makes this actually impossible, and then people have like written about it basically saying, well, you'd have to change all the laws of physics, or you'd
Yes.
have to create an environment in which like everything was miniaturized and those kind of things. So on the one hand, yeah, we know that this has always been considered a completely implausible thing to do, but because the film doesn't really, I mean, it makes the process into something that's sort of vaguely kind of like has narrative consistency and it's kind of humorous, but it's not just trying to talk about kind of the scientific process and things that can go wrong. So
Yeah.
once you've sort of suspended your disbelief for the
Yes,
physics, then
exactly.
you're a bit like, okay,
I think that's when it becomes sort of interesting. Yeah, it kind of talks more about like the ethical implications of all of this.
One of the things that we, could probably sort of touch on here is the reasoning behind doing this before we maybe go back to the process, because obviously it's been something that, like, I guess different authors have looked at for different reasons, but there's a specific reason for this, which is that basically tackling the idea of overpopulation and the
Yes.
impact of that upon the world. And we know that overpopulation is a very real issue. And again, I'll put a link in the show notes. But what we have is this overpopulation caused by obviously a drop in mortality rates and the way in which medicine is keeping people alive, food production improving, which is obviously a kind of like a good thing, but it does mean that we have too many people, and also migration and urban concentration. So by creating kind of these restricted but habitable areas, we tend to create kind of like I think it's something like half the global population live in cities, and that's only going to go up. So that means you've got density of population as well. But I was reading up about what the impact of this is, and I suppose in some ways, it's something that we can understand, but it's probably worth focusing on. Exhaustion of natural resources, particularly obviously in an unequal way, which we might talk about in a moment, leading to things like geopolitical tensions, territorial control. So there's a knock-on effect that isn't just environmental there. Degradation of the environment, for example, with like the exploitation of fossil fuels, deforestation as we spread out, needing to create more food and so on. Issues around rising unemployment, and that's something that is talked about a great deal in terms of like what happens with AI and things contributing as well. But with simply having more people and not enough jobs is a potential issue, and the way in which depopulated rural areas can actually affect ecosystems that where things have been inhabited. Now, I was a bit surprised by that one, but it's quite interesting. I thought it'd be a positive thing, but actually where human inhabitants has completely changed an ecosystem, then moving away from it can have a detrimental effect. So lots to think about there. But we're told that basically no worries about overpopulation if everybody is really tiny. Why do you think they went so small, by the way? It's like, what was it, 0.364% of the current mass and volume of people?
Yeah, it's hard to say, really.
We think it was just for the sort of like humor concept of
probably. I guess it's almost just like the sort of the extent of the reduction in scale. Like it probably is a bit of a humor. I think it's just sort of to almost when you have the sort of shots where you've got the large people and the small people together as that sort of juxtaposition, I'd say.
Right from that first moment of the guy in his tiny little podium on top of the podium.
Oh yeah, exactly. Literally looks so tiny. I mean, I don't know. It was. I think the concept is just brilliant. I think it's just funny, and I think it's really well explored. But
yeah, and mostly I thought that they seem to get the proportionality pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
Like usually with these things, like I don't know, hobbits, for example, constantly changing relative height and that sort of thing, but actually felt fairly kind of consistent, I thought. So yeah, but obviously the idea of this is that if you have less impact on the planet because you're miniaturized, then it will solve the problem of overpopulation, which in turn has a positive effect on the climate and food, water, and so on.
Yeah, they sort of frame it as the most like ethical way to like overcome, this issue rather than I think I was watching it with a friend of mine who was like, oh, how's this? I was like, but I think there's like various arguments of like how would you decrease the population, but ultimately it in the perfect world it allows people to live out the rest of their lives, and like ultimately from what we see it is just the same. Like you can't really tell the difference between the small world and the real world when there's sort of you're just stuck in one.
I think that is the thing that's supposed to be kind of like appealing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was interesting. I was reading these Quora digest of different people's responses to the original question for this one was, what would happen if all humans were suddenly reduced to the size of a typical mouse? Well, that's about what we're talking about in this particular one. And it starts off with, we would no longer have any problems with food shortages, overpopulation, or pollution, as all of our needs would drastically decrease. And then it moves further down the list to, we would have a very serious war against ants. Squirrels would be a much bigger problem than they are now.
That's so true.
I will put this Quora thing on there as well, because people have given this a lot of thought. Some of it is quite science-based, and some of it is more like, what would I do about my dog?
No. They lived in these little sort of small communities with this infrastructure around sort of shelters and buildings that protect them from like rain and other sort of environmental disasters, as well as
and
like
becoming
things
prey,
like
I think, as well as a big
becoming
thing,
prey. Hugely. Although I feel like being the size of sort of a small person that could like tame and ride a bird would be brilliant. I think that's the first thing I would do personally.
Those ecosystems wouldn't thrive properly because you've not got things like bees. That was another thought that I had. So
That's so true.
You're talking about completely changing the order of kind of biological hierarchies, aren't you, in the world?
Yeah.
So it doesn't just have an impact on humans. But yeah, you're right. It's nicely done with these little sort of domes in which certainly the first group of people live. Although we learn by the end that they're just living in the natural habitat without needing to be covered over. So they sort of adapt in that way. Before we kind of go on to those communities, which I think is a really interesting bit about this, obviously, like we see from the sort of beginning of this technology through to kind of its, and the news response and things, to then to the discussion about it, and then obviously Paul and Audrey making the decision that that's what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what did you like? We're saying it's an ethical way to do things, and what do you reckon? I mean, would you have become small in this scenario?
I mean, I think that the issue comes in is not whether you're sort of, again, considering all the like sort of science fiction aspect, and if this actually could happen, I think the issue comes in when you have the disparity between there being a group of small people and a group of large people. If everyone was either large or small, like it wouldn't be the same sort of, I'd say, kind of issues. I think there's a scene in the movie even before Paul and his wife have downsized, where this guy sort of questions what even like rights you could have.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Here's the quote. Yeah, he says, "No offense, but do you think if you're that small, you still have all the same rights as the rest of us? Same right to vote?" Paul says, "Why wouldn't we?" Well, let's see. You're not buying as many products. You're not paying as much income tax. Not really participating in our economy. In fact, you're costing us money and jobs, which is, it's an interesting thing to question.
I was trying to work out that whether I think that this is true. I mean, the right to vote, I think, is a really interesting one because, and maybe this is, kind of an American thing. It's certainly something that, all of this rhetoric reflects kind of other, like real sorts of othering, like of immigrants and racial othering and things like that. But this idea that if you don't contribute to the economy, you don't have a right to vote. And that is, that's for me a very limited way of looking at democracy, because contribution to society isn't just economic. And then I was thinking about the economics of
very
it.
capitalist way to look at it
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
And I think there is where we do run into issues, isn't it? Because as you said, it's about this split between the big and the small. Because the original plan is that like 200 to 300 year transition for the world to transform from big to small. That's what they proposed originally. But obviously, it's a minority decision within the time frame of the film, anyway. But yet there is a real kind of economic narrative here about obviously the cost within an economy for big people. When you scale down that economy to the materials and so on for small people, then obviously their costs are lower. But it's not true to say from what we see that they necessarily can't contribute to the economy, because the job that Paul does is as a telesales. So the whole point is that he can do that because his voice is not super high. He can do that and nobody can tell whether he's big or small necessarily from the phone call. So I suppose it's just again this thing about, well, it could be that there are certain jobs that somebody couldn't do, but there are probably new jobs that they could do.
I mean, especially like how 2024 is going. There's such a sort of climate like online jobs, just like being at home on your computer, where it's not like and that, exactly. I feel like as if I was a small person on a Zoom call to Claire, if Claire was like a normal sized person, like again, there wouldn't really be that. You wouldn't really know. I could be in my small
you'd just be on your small screen, but you'd look the same.
I'd look the same. Which I don't know. I mean, I think this is also another thing is like even in just physical ability. I mean, we'll come on to it a little bit later because there's a sort of subplot point with how the downsizing treatment can be abused and stuff. But the difference even in like physical abilities, like probably to murder a small person, you could just act be like, I've tripped over, I'm so sorry. And just I don't know. It's even even in that sort of sense. And
yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, judicial precedent and things like that. I mean, in America, obviously, there's the issue of the Constitution and whether that's affected. But in a country like the UK, if we were talking about it here, where we have an unwritten constitution and things are based on, well, all sorts of documentation, but also things like legal precedent, then you're talking about kind of like adapting that for these issues. And especially because we kind of see that the small people are reliant on the big people, and this is the thing that I think is at the heart of the economical issue of this. So when we look at Leisureland Estates, the place that Paul and Audrey decide they're going to get their house, then what we're dealing with is something that essentially seems to be like made for them in the way that dolls' houses would be made for a doll, or like a gerbil cage would be made for a gerbil. They're not creating things at the scale in their own miniaturized factories or something like that. So they're not active within their own economy per se. And yet also we hear this kind of fear around them, this idea that, a small person could sneak. There's a bit, it's right in the background in the film, but when you watch it, when you look at the screenplay, you can see it, worrying about people like sneaking into your home when you're like in the bathroom and watching you and things like that. So this idea that people are frightened of well, it's the otherness of it, the sort of assumption that this will make people abuse. I mean, I guess, you could say, well, yes, you could be a tiny person, you could sneak up and stick a needle full of Novichok into somebody's ankle even more easily than sort of a big assassin could do. But again, it's quite a sort of negative view, I think, of humanity.
I mean, I don't know if it's true whether the sort of like, if you have two groups of like distinct groups of people, that's always going to cultivate sort of like prejudices and stereotypes. I feel like the way that they portray it in the movie, that there's not really that much sort of inter-community interaction. I think once you become downsized, you more or less sort of stay within.
I think so. I mean, there's a few references, aren't there? So there's the single mum that Paul dates unsuccessfully in Leisureland. So she has a son whose grandparents are still big, and she talks about like how frightening that is for him. And like when they go to visit, they go to a restaurant that is supposed to be small friendly. They have their own little table on top of the table, but the restaurant, of course, is kind of manipulating the situation so far as they charge a minimum, which I guess, plays into this idea that if you were a chef, like a full-size chef, and you're trying to make food for small people, on the one hand, the ingredients that go into that are obviously minimal in terms of costs, but in terms of labor, it probably increases, unless they're also employing small people. But there wasn't much of a sense that was being done. Although it comes back to that point, surely there is an edge at which small people, like if there are sufficient small people, then you would create jobs in either world for those small people, because there would be needs to be met. I don't know, nursing and being a doctor and anything, being a window cleaner. These are things that you need to be small enough to do, right?
Another thing that me and my friends were sort of considering whilst watching is how would you, especially in the initial stages as people are becoming downsized, even make such small sort of plates of food and technology and the same sort of things that we need as regular sized human beings. If anyone's heard of Willard Wigan, he's this British sculptor who's actually really interesting, where his sculptures are placed within the eye of a needle or like on the head of a pin. And they can be small as, I think it's as small as like 0.005 millimeters.
Is he the one who reduces his heart rate to such a low level because he's got to deal with things that are so tiny? He has to,
it must
really fascinating.
Which is, it's interesting to see that you can actually make something. I mean, you wouldn't even need to make something as small as that in this sort of supposed world.
No, I mean, I suppose we're talking about like, well, I mean, I sort of mentioned that it feels a bit like a doll's housey. I'm thinking my 7-year-old niece has got all her Sylvanian families, and they have all their own like bread and plates and things. So I guess it's that kind of size, isn't it?
It's to sort of imagine the fact that things that do need to be as detailed as something in the eye of like a pin. It's like that. It can be possible. I mean,
Yeah.
if if you're listening, please look this up, Willard Wigan, because
Yeah,
it
we'll
is incredible.
put
Like the amount
a
of
link in the notes, because yeah, I agree.
the detail that he can get is literally, that is just crazy. I'm like looking at it now, I'm like, whoa.
I think what you'd be talking about, the challenges really are with the sort of technologies that I'm thinking, screens and things like that, because we see like a normal size television being like a cinema type screen, but then the idea of kind of getting that down. And I suppose again we're thinking about something, it's sort of set in the present but with a sort of futuristic element to it, I guess. So there's we're thinking sort of nanotechnology and the advances in that would all play into this, wouldn't it? But again, I think that you'd think that the long-term plan would have to be for those small people to be manufacturing their own small things, right? So these things would not seem so difficult to make if you were only 10 centimeters tall. They're difficult to make when, like, your hand is the size of one of those people. So
exactly.
What did you think of Leisureland or Leisureland?
God, it seemed very drab. I don't know if this is just the American dream or whatever, but it just seemed I mean, come to Europe, please. It's just nice.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, I do wonder where, because we only really saw it in the sort of American sense, but this, this sort of all came from this Norwegian guy. Is that the idea?
And the original Norwegian commune at the end. But yeah, you're right. Like, we're mostly focusing on the American options.
Which, I mean, sort of their idea is the sort of what really gets people in is kind of coming back to, you need less food, less resources, everything's less expensive. The equivalence of your income when you're downsized is a crazy ton more.
Yeah, there's I'm going to find the bit where they're working out how much money they will have. But you're right. So they have these houses, which on the one hand, it's like, oh, the sort of mansion you could never afford. But on the other hand, they're horrible. Like
they're huge,
the Regency version of this, which is very doll's housey. And it has, like, I don't know whether you remember, it had like miniature versions of all of these famous paintings. So it has
my God, very tasteless.
Vincent van Gogh's sort of Starry Night and things like that in tiny version, which is like humorous if you're making it for your hamster, but somehow just horrible when it's for a person.
Yeah, it's just I don't know. Because I think even when still at like the beginning, when they were initially sort of deploying this like new technology in the movie in the early stages, they were sort of showing these huge houses and being like, look at what your money right now, you've got like $150,000 worth is can afford you in Leisureland.
This is the thing. So like the Regency level estate is the equivalent of a 12,000 square foot equivalent home on a 1.5 acre equivalent lot, so mansion size, but it will only cost you £63,000 because, which, to be fair, if you were buying a doll's house, that's a lot of money, wouldn't it?
That's a lot of money.
And then it's all kind of like packaged because it's obviously like this private kind of community, so you pay for like your health and fitness package, and what it says is they would be £152,000 in equity, which is a comfortable number because it translates to $12.5 million within the relative sphere, which is, obviously only, this is a temporary way of looking at things, because if the economy shifts towards small, then it will no longer be the case for a next generation coming through. But really interesting, and leads us, I think, to this kind of thing about the fact that there's two things that get used for the sort of sales element. One is this idea, things that only rich people would be able to afford, you will be able to afford if you make yourself small enough for it. And then the idea that if you're struggling financially, this is a way out. And we see that really as an argument that comes up like a lot of times about the sorts of people who would move there. For Paul and Audrey, they're still living in his late mother's house and they can't afford to get a mortgage, even though they're both employed. There's Dave, the friend who turns up at the reunion in their little box with his wife. He had gambling debts. And there was Conrad, who whose wife had all the money. So when he got divorced, this was his way of coping. So this is a lot about this idea about kind of you're living up to a quality of life you wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, although have this real problem about this idea of kind of, first of all, the limitations of the relative value of the dollar, but also this thing about kind of like mimicking all of this stuff, like, which is the entire kind of capitalist mindset that is feeding into the whole issue of living too heavily upon the planet. Yes, you can make it small, but the mentality is
still the
the
same.
same.
Yeah, still that sort of consuming
Yeah,
things.
exactly.
You're still sort of experiencing and still purchasing and consuming these things just on a smaller scale that you believe is less. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, yeah, as you're saying, it's like generations are going to go on. The like relative value of the dollar is not going to be the same, and that ultimately it's not going to be like, you can't really live this like leisurely, luxurious lifestyle if everyone's again become downsized. But yeah, and ultimately, like, what's to say that everyone would? I mean, because obviously it's an optional thing, but even in many generations into the future, I can imagine more and more people will go into it. There's always still going to be people who are regular sized and who will therefore sort of have more overall control than
yes. And that's, I think, something that we really we do see this idea of the fact that the power, even though there's we still see examples kind of soft power from small people, like in the academic sphere and things like that, but yeah, if you've got the option to basically kind of crush with your foot the dissidents or people's whole communities and so on, then that definitely creates the potential for a lesser kind of version of human beings. And of course we see this in the terms of the abuse of power, which you mentioned before, this idea of kind of like felt very apt when there was the example of I think it says the Israelis are shrinking the Palestinians, and these specifically the shrinking of these Vietnamese dissidents in prison, of whom one of them, Ngoc Lan, we meet later on in the film, but she is also there because she's a refugee who has escaped in what is essentially, I suppose, the equivalent of the back of a lorry small boat, which is now the inside of a TV box.
Yes, yeah.
And I thought that was, they do a lot of this sort of satire on kind of like the language of racism becomes like the language spoken against small people, and then we have the kind of imagery of illegal immigration, also so-called illegal immigration, is now like inside a box rather than inside a so people smuggling, but just on a smaller scale. And of course, Ngoc Lan is the only one who survives in this box, so we're reminded again of the dangers that are faced through migration and so on. Almost like this vision of saying that things will be better if we make this move in this direction while we've still got political refugees. And in her case, she's an environmental refugee as well, because her village was flooded to facilitate the building of a new dam, a new hydroelectric dam. I think that's a really kind of side effect of this, that again the founder, the creator, hasn't kind of seen coming. And of course it's this the manipulation of the system by people who have power and can use it to then get rid of essentially their enemies, but without committing, I guess, genocide or something.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that we really notice about this kind of community is, of course, that we see it at this sort of high level of, if you've got what is sort of this medium amount of equity and you can afford to do the I think it's $15,000 for the couple when Paul and Audrey.
I mean, I was going to say, as we're saying, it's almost a sort of this financial escape, of any sort of financial strains that you might have.
But you've still got to have $15,000.
You still have to have $15,000, yeah.
Enough money to sort of,
carry you through to the end.
Carry through to the end, exactly.
It is still not something that like every single person could really have a choice in doing.
No, exactly.
These like two extremes of people who are already extremely wealthy in the regular sized world, who wouldn't see much point in downsizing anyway, because they're in a position where those sort of immediate financial effects, but also future environmental effects aren't going to affect them. I mean, as we were sort of saying, Don't Look Up, the rich are just going to like shoot themselves off space. sort of cryogenic chambers, and then there's the other side of that where you just can't point blank afford that at all. I
No.
mean, yeah, and it's and then at the end of the day, someone's still profiting off that. Where's the
Yeah.
$15,000 going?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is a real question there about, these prices seem really low, and then you think about them in terms of kind of the profit margin that must be going on
Yeah.
there, especially on the housing and stuff. And there's also, I don't know, I mean, again, it really reflects, I think, some of the language that, gets used in racist context about such and such a community doesn't like want to work, doesn't want to contribute, those sorts of things. But there's the bit where Dishan is complaining. So this is Paul's upstairs neighbor, this Serbian businessman who basically seems to have decided to get small because he saw the commercial opportunities in it of bringing luxury consumables to the small person. And he complains that basically, like in the small world, no one wants to work. And Conrad basically says, what did you expect? That is the wonderful thing about becoming small. You are immediately rich. Unless you are very poor, then you are only small.
Yes.
Which leads us very nicely into the sort of hidden parts of Leisureland, which are not visible on the tour. So we should fill in some plot gaps here. One of the one of the things that happens is that Audrey, Paul's wife, does not, in fact, go through with her downsizing.
It was actually pretty hilarious because the whole time these friends that I was watching this movie with, I'd seen this as part of the clip that I saw on TikTok, was the fact that Paul's wife decides not to go through the procedure. But I think there's a bit as they're sort of signing the papers, these legal papers, being like, "Will you consent to this?" That they say, "Oh, there's like a 1 in 200,000 chance that you're not going to survive the procedure, that you're going to be like severely disabled or blah 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 blah." And they're the whole entire time my mates are like, "Oh my god, she's not going to make it. She's going to die. She's going to die. She's going to die." The look on their faces, it is actually that heart sinking thing that like the one person you decide to go through this procedure with decides to not do. Like he's just gone out there into this like, well, I don't know. That was like proper, like I'd be heartbroken. That was crazy betrayal from Audrey.
I felt that there was something there about this idea that you're not going to fix a relationship that's got problems by just getting small together. It also puts Paul into this very difficult situation because, of course, all of this question about their equity and so on was based on their joint income and assets. I mean, the other thing about Audrey is that, and this is, I think, something that, we've talked about this idea that, yes, this is supposed to be environmental, but most of the time, what is it like? When the Dishan is talking about this and like the opportunities that he's found, and he's basically like, this is not about the environment. He says, when I see big people becoming small, all the new small cities, I see opportunity. I ask myself, Dushan, why are the people they become small? To help the environment? Please. They become small to have the things which until now were only for the rich. But there's more than that, which is also this idea that people see it as like they don't care about the environmental impact of it, but they also don't care about the kind of hidden costs behind all of this, like how do you run this kind of city and that sort of thing. And there's something about like the grass is greener and so on. We just won't think about the implications. But with Audrey, there was another thing I thought, which is basically the point at which, and this is again, I thought it was very funny, but the point at which she changes her mind is when they shaved off the first of her eyebrows. Like she's so vain and she's so like, oh, I just realized I was doing it only for you and I have to do something for myself. And Paul is like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Oh, that was good comedy beat in that part. It was good. Yeah, and I think you get them both on the phone being like, and then they sort of cut to her with like one eyebrow on or something. It's so good.
That's right.
So
and and he's like, you have to come and see me. We can sort this out. It's like, oh, I can't see you small. I'm already too hurt. Like she's the one who's suffering. So I think he was well read there. But there's all of these kind of different levels of like why you would or wouldn't do something, economics, but also like vanity and things like that. But that does lead us into this kind of levels of hidden costs, which is that we see like the glorious, disgusting Regency Manors, and then we see like Paul's flat is quite nice. Dushan has this like crazy party flat upstairs, all very elegant. But it's only once Paul decides that he will go with Knocklan and he will go to her home to help her, that we see like the suburbs, and then we see like, well, where do all the people who serve this community, where do the working classes live? What about the housekeepers and the people who allow you to have this lavish lifestyle? And that's where we realize that all the class inequalities just persist in the small world. So although there's like this difference between the big and the small, the classic being when on the call center, the woman on the phone says, "Don't be short with me," to Paul, and he's like, "What did you say?" Like shortest language. But then there's like his own prejudices continue. Like he thinks that Knocklan is stealing the drugs when actually like Duchan has just been like, yeah, take all the medicine that you don't need, presumably because buying medication is now cheap for somebody like him.
Yeah.
And he kind of like has this view, she's a cleaner, so she must be like this, and you know, she must want this for herself because she's an addict or something. Whereas actually, of course, what we learn is Knocklan is caring for her dying friend. So what do you think about that scene where they get down to the like the wall?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's clearly sort of breaking down people's sort of own assumptions, and well, also the audience is sort of experiencing it at the same time. It's not even like a sort of dramatic eye or anything. Like, you know, it is, you know, it's kind of this, again, sort of perfect leisure land is sort of framed as this perfect sort of world, and then it's sort of almost not even like a blissful ignorance, but people can't really, you wouldn't really comprehend that there's still like that sort of other like poverty side of it.
Out of sight, out of mind. Yeah.
Out of sight, out of mind, exactly.
Duchan can have these parties where like it's Paul waking up underneath the coffee table and Duchan with his the two girls that he spent the night with and things like that, and someone will come in who are of course foreign workers who will clear it all up.
Yeah, exactly.
Reminding us, I suppose, as you say, this kind of like American dream of success. You only get up to the top of the ladder by having people you can kind of like crush below you to pick up all the pieces. And there's particularly like Knocklan, she'd been really famous for being this dissident and this environmentalist and things like that. And like Duchan says something about like the famous Knocklan, dramatic escape from Vietnamese prison and almost died, so now she can clean my house. America, big land of opportunity.
Yeah, it is just that extreme. I mean, one of the questions was exactly, when you are downsized, they sort of promote it as this, you don't have to work, you know, can live off your savings for the rest of your life. But who, you know, considering that if sort of leisure land still has these sort of communal, you know, third spaces, who is again running, you know, those sort of bars and events, and who's cleaning up, and who, you know, is exactly. So there must be that, it is again that sort of outside, out of mind. And it kind of feeds back into, like, especially in COVID, people only really started thinking about this sort of like workers such as, I mean, nurses are definitely in, like, you know, everyone's sort of working together, but I guess that's a sort of different type of essential worker. But
no, but you're right, I think that is true. Yeah,
people like cleaners, so you don't really think about that. And again, it is that sort of American dream of like, oh, their Paul's, you know, neighbor is just like, oh, and there goes the cleaner who was like this once environmental activist.
And I think that very much amplified by the highlighting of the racial differences, again, very much like kind of, you know, we've talked there's a bit about class here, but particularly I think class is obviously something we think about a lot in Britain, but the racial element really reflects the respective wealth in American society. And it's not until we get out into that, through the wall, into this place where basically everybody's living in kind of converted, what they called like containers, like off the back of transport trucks, turned into these kind of makeshift blocks of flats. And the people who we encounter are people of color, people who are sick and therefore cannot work. We see representation of disability. Knocklan is one of those because she has an amputated leg, but we also see people talking in ASL, for example, suggesting that that's kind of something that is excluded. We've not seen any of that reflected in kind of how society functions in the main part of leisure land, and just diversity of race, but very few white people. you know, what we've seen so far has been majority white in white and kind of privileged of America, but also of Europe and so on. So I think that really comes to light there. And again, taking something that I suppose is particularly an American example, we know that America obviously has the biggest disparity in access to healthcare of like any Western country, and that still persists, even though one assumes things like drugs and so on should be, in relative terms, very accessible. But we're told like we've only got the bad doctors now, because like if you failed in the real world, you've been shrunk down and you doing this. And Lan is looking after this Mexican woman who is dying of cancer, and Paul is the one who's basically, she's like, be like a doctor, be like a doctor. It's like, I'm not a doctor, I'm an occupational therapist without a license who works in a call center. And the funny, very dark humor of where the woman has, what happened to your friend? She died. I think I gave her too much drugs. It's like, she died smiling.
Died smiling. It's dark. It's dark. I guess it's also quite funny how sort of she's so unfazed. Like you can tell she's been, you know, like it's just it is dark, but it is. I think it does have some pretty good.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
sort of
there were people, I believe, who like criticized kind of the character because of the fact that she speaks in broken English and so on. But I know that the actor and also kind of like some of the critics who are really pro this sort of characterization point out that she's a really nuanced character, very funny, but also got a lot of kind of different layers there. And one of the things that she was really showing Paul, who is, obviously deeply miserable and so on, is kind of like she's not messing around, kind of like having a great deal of time for sort of emotions or like even like the big ideas of injustice. It's about how am I going to make life better for this person? How can I get food for this person? And when Paul, I was reading about something about this idea of like in fiction where like men are made small, you can really explore like the gendered aspect of it, that somehow it's like emasculating and so on. And that's not something this film particularly plays around with, but there is something about Paul where he's like, I can fix a prosthetic foot.
And then breaks it. Yeah.
And then she's like, okay, so now you have to do my cleaning job for me because you've broken my foot. But yeah, so I mean, a real sense, I think, of that kind of like, this is supposed to recognize the impacts of an environmental crisis, and all it's really doing is perpetuating the same social injustices that we know the climate crisis is also causing, which might bring us quite nicely onto the sort of like environmental message of the kind of last part of the film. And so we've got this guy Deschamps and his business partner Conrad, and they are basically doing things like making 2,000 tiny little Cuban cigars out of one Cuban cigar and selling them. And I think that he basically seems to import, like, presumably illegally, full-size bottles of vodka on like being dragged behind the boat that so Conrad has this boat that gets like FedExed around the world to the places he wants to go visit, and they say they're going to go to the original commune in Norway. They want to take Paul, mainly I think because Deschamps thinks that Paul is pathetic and should like have something better done with his life. And when they tell Lan this, she's like, I'm going with you. And once she's made up her mind, she seems like very much like, okay, that's it. It's happening. I'm going. And then we also see some emotion there. This idea that like Dr. Asbjørnsen had like really reached out to her when he found out like how his technology had been used to harm her. So she really wants to go. And we get this complete shift in the whole like backdrop. We're suddenly in the Norwegian fjords, being seen presumably from this tiny boat, so they seem even more like impressive. The water, the cliffs, it's all like immensely beautiful. But when we meet Jørgen Asbjørnsen and his wife, they are actually really depressed, and the reason they're really depressed is something we've seen hinted at previously, which is this idea of having reached an environmental tipping point. specifically the one that they talk about in the film, and we were discussing this a little bit more because I looked it up slightly, was to do with the idea of the Antarctic glaciers shifting and melting and releasing methane, which in turn was contributing to greater global heating and thus more melting of glaciers and so on. And basically saying that this most recent methane release was kind of a catastrophic turning point from which the Earth could not recover, presumably to do with the rise in temperatures that it would then cause and the irreversibility of what has happened. And so I was looking this up, and again, we'll put a bit of a link to this Cambridge study, which is actually looking at the Arctic rather than the Antarctic, but the premise seems to be very much the same. Basically, saying that methane emissions are likely to increase as Arctic glaciers retreat, more springs are exposed, and these groundwater springs have large stocks of methane gas that leaks from them. And basically that, this is exacerbated, could exacerbate global warming, is the language that they're using, and that this has not necessarily been considered as part of the kind of global methane budget, the full extent of this. So these tipping points, again, some interesting kind of research that I looked into for this, but basically we know that among the identified tipping points, climate tipping points in Earth's climate system, it is sea ice. So looking at the Antarctic ice sheets collapse, one of which would occur at the 2-degree global warming point, and also in the Arctic as well, the Greenland ice sheet collapse, same issue. This is something that would happen sooner rather than later in terms of the degrees of global warming. So this is obviously something that this doctor feels that kind of his strategy has failed, like he hasn't been able to get enough people to do what he wanted, and he gives this speech.
The world has already seen 5 major extinctions. Another will be another. I didn't want to believe it. None of us did, but there we were in Helsinki, big and small, climatologists, bacteriologists, demographers, physicists, immunologists, 26 Nobel Prize winners among us. We built all the models, did all the math, and our conclusion was consistent. Homo sapiens will soon vanish from the earth. It is now an actuarial certainty. No matter how the end will come, environmental disaster, pandemic disease, unbreathable air, impotable water, not enough food, nuclear winter, some combination of them all. Relatively soon, the earth will indeed purge itself of human life, and God knows how many other species.
Do you really mean extinction? What about downsizing?
Yeah, too little, too late. Only 3% of the world has miniaturized. There simply isn't enough time. Not a very successful species, this Homo sapiens, even with such great intelligence. Barely 200,000 years. Alligator has survived 200 million years with a brain the size of a walnut.
What do we think about this kind of like attitude? Because for him, he sees this as like a point of no return, and as a consequence, he and his kind of group of followers are going to go down into a bunker in the ground and stay there for 8,000 years until the world fixes itself.
I mean, again, it's kind of that a bit of a strategy of like self-preservation and sort of. I mean, obviously this character here is like a bit. He's one of those. He's sort of depicted as this scientist, sort of breakthrough scientist. It's kind of, I think it's pushed as this sort of thing where he knows what he's talking about. Whilst I think in the movie, there's also people who are like saying, "What's the rush?"
Yeah.
It's not like the world's ending. Gonna collapse. The climate's gonna collapse tomorrow. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, you can sort of definitely see that Paul has that like toying sort of, oh, am I going to join them and am I going to stay sort of kind of debate in his head about it. I mean, again, it kind of just, it feels like that same sort of concept as, go listen to our episode on Don't Look Up, but kind of just sort of saying, okay, wait, we've got the option to just sort of hide ourselves away for 8,000 years, and our future generations are going to come out to when the Earth itself has eventually recovered. But I don't know. It's hard because again, it is that the difference there is that point of no return, and especially with, as the sort of ideas described, it's going to be this positive feedback, and
I mean, I think that on the one hand, there's something really important about kind of acknowledging these tipping points, because at the moment they seem to be sailing past relatively frequently, or looming relatively fast, without them being given the gravity that perhaps we need to. On the other hand, there's this kind of doomsday language which seems to kind of like scare people off from engaging with the kind of actual issues.
Yes.
And I'm going to suggest that we look at a show called Last Light, which I watched quite recently, which deals with something very similar about kind of like, how do you get people to wake up to a tipping point? But obviously, like, for this group of people in Norway, they've decided that what they're going to do is make sure that the species is preserved. That's basically their aim. And yeah, Paul is going to go with them, and then he doesn't, because he realizes he's in love and so on. So he comes back. There's another aspect of the story. But I think that there's an impact. I don't know. I mean, I think it's really interesting with the kind of like scientists who really kind of campaign against extinction events, and there's some really kind of important voices out there. But sometimes this question about whether like they're treated as kind of like wacky outsiders, even though they're the ones who kind of know the facts. And that's a little bit of the way in which this kind of community is depicted, because they're very kind of like hippie. They're all like, it's communal living, socialism, which obviously makes everybody very nervous within America. And it's wearing like, there's this bit of Paul's got like changed into these like natural woven clothes, and he's like playing a drum and sitting in a circle and chanting and all this stuff. Like, so they're like shown to be a bit kind of like far out from that perspective. But then there's obviously the whole set of stuff that doesn't get covered, which is, okay, so they've built this incredible underground vault, which is relying on completely on geothermal energy, has its own kind of like mimicking of the sun, things like that. Who funded this? That's the question I want to know.
Yeah.
Because that's always the issue, and if we can fund that and put that level of innovation into this vault, why can't we, obviously, like, there's this tipping point, but there's an amelioration that's possible, surely, in terms of with the right innovation and the right investment. So I guess we're supposed to think maybe that Paul, both kind of for like the big reason of whether, shutting your community in the ground and just waiting it out is the right thing to do. The fact that he comes back, he also of course puts Noklan and his love for her first, so that he doesn't do kind of like what Audrey did to him, I guess. So that's kind of a good thing. Dushan thinks that people will go mad and kill each other down in the vault. Do you reckon?
Potentially. I mean, do they mention the numbers of people that are going down to the
That's
vault?
an interesting one. It doesn't look like that many, although they do seem to have taken things like semen and so on with them, presumably to diversify the gene pool, because there doesn't seem to be like that many. I was reading another book that I might write about for a book of the week, that does a similar thing, but with a space mission instead. And I think, we're talking about an entire stadium full of people kind of required for the skill set and the gene diversity and things like that to reestablish. So they don't seem to have really thought that through, unless they're talking about basically creating, I guess, artificial embryos from this bank of semen and ova that they've taken. Not sure.
I wish at that point gets proper like dystopian.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of
there's
weird.
Whole other film to be set down in the vault.
Film. A Downsizing 2. Exactly. Tune in 8,000 years into the future. No, there's a lot of questions. I mean, again, I I feel like we've talked before about the difference between like having sort of, again, we've got this like right now living this sort of global scale capitalist world, whilst on a smaller scale you could enact, I don't know, more sort of like socialist living standards of more of a community. And again, that's where it kind of comes into that difference between like responsibility and sort of community justice, and like how that would affect really like where how it would influence the way people behave around one another. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it reminds me, I mentioned this book, The Future, which I've also put on book recommendations, and I talked about it previously, but there's a whole narrative in this about this idea about kind of like how to survive the kind of end times, or like a survivalist planning is all about kind of this idea that people must work together in communities, as we've talked about before. But also one of the other things that this novel does is this idea of basically saying kind of what would happen if we took all the kind of potential around basically tech conglomeration and the sort of impact of tech power, which this idea that these kind of leaders in this kind of corporate tech world have more power than government leaders do. I was listening to an interview with Bill Gates the other day, who thinks this isn't true because he doesn't have an army or whatever, but I think that we could really question that. But what happened if you actually focused all of that into finding solutions? That's the only kind of hopeful future out of all of this. But you're right, I mean, this film particularly, I think, gives us this idea that there's something about community and pulling together. But also, I know right at the end we've got Paul going back with Knocklan and going back to this kind of life they were living, where Paul, who always wanted to be a doctor, didn't become one because he had to go home and look after his mother, who was had fibromyalgia, was housebound and so on. So he hadn't done that, and then he hadn't had a successful marriage, and then he hadn't continued working as an occupational therapist and all these kinds of things. And he's like, I'm going to be part of like the destiny of the human race. And then he doesn't do that. He goes back to just kind of like get leftovers from restaurants and take them to the people who need them, and like practice what medicine he can to help in the community. What does that say, I suppose, as a message of what to do within this crisis situation?
I mean, ultimately, I think he's been under influence of Knocklan. He's kind of decided, I mean, she sort of says at the end, I think we're saying how that ultimately the people who are going to need help are going to be above ground and who need, what does she say? What does she say?
People here need help, not down stupid holes.
I think she puts it a little more eloquently than I did, but I think there's a bit of like especially with Paul's sort of storyline, finding a bit of like purpose and self-identity, and like throughout this whole sort of experience, I feel like as you're sort of listing off these like things that he's gone through in his life, his sort of failed marriage, his like failed dreams of becoming a doctor, I think he does find a bit of a purpose with Knocklan and helping these people in the end,
and finds it in the most unusual place, really, because it's through Dushan, his crazy, slightly dodgy Serbian partying neighbor, and Knocklan, the cleaner whose prosthetic foot he breaks. It's not the big kind of like idea of networking and
he just kind of almost fell into that.
And I think there's something, Paul goes from saying, you can't just be worried about a few little people thousands of miles away, you have to look at the big picture. But actually, ultimately, that is exactly what he does.
Exactly what he does, yeah. He works on a very like individual sort of person-to-person level, which you could argue that's almost, you could say it's a bit futile, but I don't know, like I think it is, I don't know. It's hard. It is hard because I think there is that sort of point to drive home about being like, look at the big picture, but also who is going to help those people.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually maybe some of us, that is exactly what we can do. I was interested that my father, who hopefully will never listen to this, but has been lying awake at night worrying about how we've managed to his the boomer generation perhaps has managed to fuck up the world and so on. I suspect his version of how they fucked up the world and my version are different, but nonetheless, that's, it's this interesting. And my mother saying, by contrast, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And actually, I think, well, yeah, okay, in a way, that futility is something that we can all really feel, especially if we kind of think that, our impact of the ballot box is lost. You might go into a kind of a career that has some kind of impact in some area of science or something, so that maybe transforms certain lives. I do work educationally, so you transform like one person's life a little bit here, a little bit there, whatever. These are tiny things, but actually for most of us, that's the stuff that we will be able to do. It's to touch certain lives. And so I think actually there's something, if we look at the fact that the state of the world impacts more heavily on certain people than on others, and it's those underprivileged people. So whether it's about the sick, the disabled, those who are unable to work, those who, for example, people in certain parts of the world that will be more negatively impacted by climate disaster, women who we know are disproportionately impacted in many communities because of the environment. And whether it's the fact that as your neighbor is no longer able to like pay for heating to be on as long, are you making sure that that one person is warm enough or able to have hot food or whatever? But maybe that's all we can do some of the time. And Knock Land's kind of like, yeah, she has been a protester, she has demonstrated against kind of corporations destroying her village, but then she's also like, no, I think Paul says something like, why aren't you writing books and giving speeches? And she's like, I have to work to live. And then we actually realize that she's not just working to live, she's like working to make sure that all of these other people are fed and kept alive and so on. Or die happy in the case of the woman she's looking after. But so that's a bit of a different message in a way from some of because it's not like the individualist message of like The Last of Us or something where it's like just look after your family or your like found family or whatever. It's bigger than that, but it's not the kind of like try and save the world sort of thing either. Like we can save the world by saving the people like in need in our immediate vicinity, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's lots to think about.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so we think that one of the flaws of this film is in a way it packs too much in, but from the discussion point of view, there's something quite good about that. So anything else you wanted to say about this film?
I think that pretty much covers quite a lot of it, to be honest. But
I suppose what we should say again is that it's got these serious, but it is also quite funny. So
yes, it is a good one. I feel like it's one of those dystopias which like I think we cover a lot of heavy
exactly
sort of topics. And this one is quite, it like can sort of in certain perspectives be a bit like, oh, that's a lot to think about. But if you want like a light-hearted, just sit back, have a bit of a laugh, have a bit of a bit of a weird film sort of night. Oh, this is a good one. This is a fun one.
So enjoy that. I think that just thank you for finding it on TikTok and bringing it to our attention. So that's great. Okay, so thank you for listening to our episode on downsizing. We've made a slight change to the programming just because we've heard a lot of talk about this new BBC drama called The Way, with the wonderful Michael Sheen in it.
Love a bit of Michael Sheen.
And as we said to each other, it's set in Wales and we're not representing the Welsh enough. So you don't get that many Welsh dystopias. So we're going to cover that in episode 14, and then we will simply push back 1 week, one episode, one fortnight on Badland Hunters, which is slightly kind of quirky Korean film on, I think, Netflix. So so that will be the fortnight after. But do join us for The Way in 2 weeks' time, and before that, we will also have our next newsletter out. So that's in the intervening Sunday, as it were. Please do let us know all your thoughts, things that we should be covering. We'll keep updating our list of future things. And you can contact us on Instagram at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs, or by email, dystopianfictioncurrentaffairs@gmail.com. And you can find out all the other bits and pieces that we do by going to our link tree. in Instagram, including a place to donate should you feel so inclined. But possibly more important to us, rather than just money, is rates and reviews. If you love what we do, please do let everybody know by reviewing us on your preferred podcasting platform.
Yeah, and spread the word.
That's right. Well, thank you very much, Masha.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.